committee meeting with author Dinesh D'Souza. He's written a new book, What's So Great About Christianity? Mr. D'Souza, what is so great about Christianity?
I think that all of the central institutions and values that we cherish in Western civilization are in some ways the legacy of Christianity. If you think of something like representative democracy or the abolition of slavery, the equal dignity of women, even a social value like compassion. Before Christianity, you had ancient Greece and Rome, and you only have to go back to that time to see compassion was not considered to be an important social value. In fact, Aristotle almost looks down upon it. So Christianity brought new values into the world, including the values that secular people and even atheists cherish. So I think that's why even the atheist should, in some ways, even if not a believer, say, thank God for Christianity.
A lot of different kinds of Christians in the world. What do you call yourself? What are you?
I call myself a mainstream Christian, a traditional Christian. C.S. Lewis used the term mere Christianity, and what he meant by that is the Christian who holds to the central doctrines of Christianity, the common ground shared between all the denominations. So I'm not interested in denominational crossfire or a highly politicized Christianity. I'm interested in mainstream Christianity, and it is that has become, in some ways, a live issue in our culture.
Were you raised as a Christian?
I was raised as a Christian, but in a lukewarm way. The Portuguese missionaries came to a part of India that I'm from called Goa. And so I was born a Christian, but as often happens, I learned a kind of crayon Christianity at my parents' knee, and then when I went off to college, it was easily shattered by the currents of skepticism and doubt and questions that I couldn't answer. So in adulthood, I have had something that the author Chesterton called a revolt into orthodoxy, and what he means by that is sort of rediscovering your childhood faith and realizing that there is an adult way, a mature way to understand it, very different than the Christianity I learned when I was 5 years old.
If you're reading the Bible, do you choose a certain one? Is there a certain text that you rely on?
Not really. Remember that the Bible was originally written in Aramaic, in Greek, so we are looking at different translations. I think the King James translation is a majestic and wonderful one, but there are other good ones as well. I think the important thing with the Bible is not to read it in a crude way literally. The Bible has parables, it has metaphors, it has prophecy. It operates on different levels. In fact, the early Christians read the Bible on multiple levels. They read it on the one hand as a historical narrative, but they also read it as a sort of spiritual, a morality tale, if you will. So I try to read the Bible contextually rather than, you may say, literally.
What do you think of the current condition of Christianity in the world?
Contrary to what many people think, Christianity is booming worldwide. In fact, most people might think that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, but it's not so. Christianity is actually the fastest. Islam is second. The world is experiencing a kind of religious revival. If you don't see it, or if we don't see it, it's because we live in the wrong neighborhood. We have seen a powerful current of secularism in the West, more advanced in Europe than in America, but advanced even in America. I think what's new is we're seeing atheism being advocated as a serious alternative to Christianity for the first time now in our culture. And so my book, What's So Great About Christianity, is a sort of counter to atheism, but interestingly, it doesn't try to defend Christianity by appealing to the Bible or the Christian tradition. It meets the atheists on their own ground, which is the ground of reason and history and philosophy and science and evidence. And in a sense, I turn the skeptical lens on the atheists and say, okay, let's look at the evidence for your claims.
Christopher Hitchens has a recent book, God is Not Great. You had a debate with him. Are you specifically addressing them in this book, or is the audience different than that?
I began this book as an exploration of how Christianity has shaped America and the West. So I began it as an historical book, but then these atheist books began to come out one by one with titles like The God Delusion, or God is Not Great, or The End of Faith. And so I realized that these guys were making claims that went beyond history, and they deserve to be answered. So I refocused the book to make it a kind of answer to these new atheists. But on the other hand, behind the new atheists, I think, are the great philosophers of the last century or so who have been the real, you may say, deep thinkers of modern atheism. I'm thinking of people like the philosopher Nietzsche or Bertrand Russell, in some ways Freud, the philosopher Heidegger. Those are the larger-than-life figures who are behind the somewhat more Lilliputian new atheists that we see running around in our culture.
Is there a tension between science and Christianity? Are there great scientists who are Christian?
Well, I think that the science and Christianity are both making claims about reality. In that sense, they do have an overlapping domain, but I don't think that there is an inherent conflict. There have been some points of conflict in history, although even those can be somewhat exaggerated. See, if you make a list of the great scientists of the past 300 years, a list that would surely include Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Boyle and Rutherford, Maxwell, Gassendi, all the way through the 20th century. And you take a look at this list, you'll see that, well, maybe 95% of the scientists on that list were theists, and the vast majority specifically Christian. Now, the point isn't that just that they happened to be Christian, they saw their work as illuminating, you may say, God's hand in the universe. And so they saw their spiritual beliefs and their scientific vocation as closely linked.
Is there a natural tension between Christianity and Islam, or Christianity and Hinduism, other religions? Do you address that in this book?
I do think that it's not right to say that all religions are equally right or equally true, because religions do make some competing claims about the world. In the past, these differences provoked hostility, in some cases war. I think what's interesting today is that we can recognize that these religions are making different kinds of claims. Now, they do have some common ground. What is the common ground? The common ground is on the arena of morality. If you look at the moral teachings of the great religions, and someone has actually compiled these, you find large areas of overlap. On the other hand, the differences are in, you may say, theology, in the domain of revelation. And I think Christianity in some ways is different from the other religions in that it offers a totally different answer to the human problem. There's this big gap, you might say, between God and man. And if you look at most religions, let's say Judaism or Islam, they have a set of codes and commandments, dietary rules. If you do these things, then as men, we can rise to the level where we are acceptable to God. Christianity just proclaims that project impossible. It's sort of like saying no matter how high you jump, you're not going to reach. God has to descend to man's level. And so this idea of the incarnation, God becoming man, is a unique Christian answer to the question of how the gap between man and God can be bridged.
Let's say there's an agnostic watching this, and they want from you, they want to read a book, not your own, but an old book, an old theologian that has the strongest argument for Christianity. Where would you send them?
I would direct the agnostic to a rather eccentric book published by the mathematician, the scientist, and the philosopher Pascal. It's called the Pensées, P-E-N-S-E-E-S, which just means meditations. And the book is not a systematic treatise. It's easy to read. It's whimsical. It's very shrewd observations about life. But it presents Christianity, if you will, from the outside. It doesn't assume the truth of Christianity. I think in some ways it's the most insightful apologetic that we have. And so I would recommend Pascal's Pensées as a good starting point.
And finally, about conservatism, you are a conservative. Is there a link between Christianity and conservatism for you?
That's a very hard question. If I think back when my Christian faith in my college years got a little bit shaken by skeptical challenges, I think I tended to cling to conservatism as a more hard-headed, a more, if you will, a more tangible interpretation of reality. I think now that I've gotten a little bit older, I remain firmly a conservative. I don't think you have to be a conservative to be a Christian by any means. I don't see Christianity as political in that sense. But I do see my conservative social values as deriving in some ways ways from my Christian upbringing. In that sense, I also think the conservative understanding of human nature, which is human nature not seen as wonderful. If you give people freedom, they will always use it well. The conservatives have a little bit more skeptical idea of human nature. Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. That's the conservative view, and it's also the Christian view.
Since we're at a conservative conference here in February of 2008, how do you see conservatism right now? What's its condition?
The condition of conservatism is now uncertain. I think a big question mark. The Reagan era that began in 1980, and many of us came of age politically in that era, has played itself out. The problem is that many conservatives today are trying to restore the success of Reagan by just regurgitating the slogans and in some cases the actual policies that Reagan advocated in 1980. The problem is the world is different now. So the way to be a conservative is not to just regurgitate Reagan, but to apply Reaganite principles to a new situation. Remember that Reagan was the product of some very creative conservative thought that came out in the 1960s and 70s. Supply-side economics, the notion of missile defenses, all of this was not invented by Reagan. It was invented earlier, and Reagan grabbed it. The problem is it's not just that the conservative candidates are disappointing. Conservative intellectual life has declined. It's focused too much on strategy, who's up, who's down, not enough fresh thinking going on. And so I see the conservative movement in some senses as, you may say, a little decadent, and by decadent in the sense that it's lost that original energy. It's sort of petering out a little bit. It's a little tired, and I think it's looking for a new leadership, but also new ideas.
How do you get that?
I think in some cases it often requires a new generation to do that, because the Reaganites, if you will, are too much a product of their own time. And so you need new people coming along saying, wait a minute, you know, the Cold War is over and we cannot just understand radical Islam as a sort of new version of the war against fascism or the war against the Soviet Empire. This is a different thing we're dealing with. With fascism, you had to get rid of it. With communism, you had to, so the ideology itself was the problem. But what reasonable person would say we have to get rid of Islam? That's ridiculous. It's not going to happen even if you think it should. So we need a different way to think about the Islamic radicalism than the old models, and that I think needs to happen now.
The author is Dinesh D'Souza, and his book is What's So Great About Christianity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next Sunday on In Depth, a 3-hour discussion with